The Zindi commander Belos pointed and laughed as his warriors stormed Craig Young's workshop, mocking the rusted-out human tank. But Belos stopped laughing as the ancient war machine suddenly roared to life and its cannon swiveled to aim right at his ugly face. Craig, a 35-year-old mechanic and war veteran, had been tinkering with the old tank, a relic from the century-old Great Galactic War between humans and Zindi when the aliens attacked. He heard the city's alarms blare, warning of incoming Zindi ships unleashing plasma hellfire. Craig sprinted outside and saw Belos's massive warship descending, raining destruction. As a veteran, Craig's instinct was to fight. But Earth had few weapons left after 100 years of relative peace as an interstellar trade hub. Tensions with the Zindi remained high as the aliens still viewed humans as primitives, but the galactic community had moved on from war. Until today. Craig raced back to his workshop, and the only weapon he had, the ancient rusted tank. He scrambled inside the cramped metal coffin, frantically flipping switches and pumping levers to bring the dead systems back online. He heard Zindi soldiers stomping closer, Belos barking orders to raise the building and kill any humans. Sweat poured down Craig's face. His hands shook. The war machine remained lifeless and cold. Earth needed this tank operational again. It may be their only hope against the Zindi attack. If Craig failed, humanity could burn once more. The tank sputtered. Craig slammed the console. The soldiers were at the door, Belos laughing. With a deafening roar, the tank's engine ignited. The Zindi commander Belos and his soldiers approached the mechanic's workshop, weapons drawn. As the rusted old tank came into view, Belos let out a mocking cackle. Look at this primitive scrap heap the humans call a weapon. Blast open those doors. I want to personally drag that mechanic out and mount his worthless tank in my trophy room. The soldiers took aim with their plasma rifles, unleashing searing bolts that ripped through the thin metal doors. Inside the cramped tank interior, Craig's hands shook as he frantically tried to hotwire the ignition. Sparks flew from frayed wires. Alarms blared from the antique control panel. Belos's heavy footfalls echoed closer. Soldiers' shadows stretched into the workshop. Craig took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and connected the final 2 wires. The tank's mighty diesel engine roared to life with a belch of black smoke. It was the most beautiful sound Craig had ever heard. Belos froze mid-stride, shock registering on his ugly face. But Craig was already swinging the tank's cannon around, the barrel coming to rest aimed right at the stunned Zindi soldiers. He slammed the trigger. The tank buckled as the shell exploded from the barrel in a massive gout of flame. It struck the ground right in front of Belos, the shockwave hurling the aliens back like ragdolls. Belos pulled himself to his feet, scales smoldering, eyes murderous. "Shoot that tank!" The soldiers opened up on full auto, plasma bolts pinging off the tank's thick hide. Craig ducked instinctively, but the shots didn't even scratch the paint. His fear turned to boldness. The tank lurched forward, treads finding purchase on the cracked concrete floor. Belos realized the danger too late. He tried to dive clear, but the tank clipped him and sent him tumbling. Craig pushed the throttle to full, aiming for the gaping hole where the workshop doors used to be. Soldiers screamed and scattered as 65 tons of steel crushed them beneath its relentless treads. Craig crashed through the workshop's outer wall in a shower of bricks and dust. The tank emerged onto the embattled city streets, ready to bring the fight to the aliens. Behind him, Belos pulled himself from the rubble, murder in his eyes, as he watched the tank rumble away. Craig wrestled the rumbling tank down the rubble-strewn streets, dodging craters and smashed vehicles. The city was a war zone, plasma bolts and explosions erupting in every direction. As he rounded a corner, he spotted a knot of human civilians pinned down behind an overturned bus, Zindi soldiers advancing on their position. Among the cowering survivors, Craig recognized a familiar face. Mike Sanders, an old war buddy. The grizzled veteran was laying down covering fire with a battered rifle, trying to protect the civilians. But the Zindi were closing in, plasma rifles spitting deadly bolts. Craig didn't hesitate. He wrenched the tank into a hard skid. putting its bulk between the civilians and the Xindi. The aliens' shots pinged harmlessly off the tank's thick front glasses. Craig thumbed the external speakers. "Craig, you crazy bastard! I thought I recognized this heap of junk." The civilians scrambled to safety as Craig held the Xindi at bay, the tank's machine guns chattering. Mike sprinted to the tank and hauled himself up, dropping into the gunner's seat beside Craig. "Just like old times, huh?" Mike quipped, swiveling the main gun around. Together they pushed forward, the tank grinding over rubble and debris. Mike sent shell after shell downrange, blasting Xindi soldiers apart and turning their vehicles into flaming wrecks. Craig kept them moving, using the tank's bulk to shield Mike from return fire. From his vantage point on a shattered rooftop, Belos watched the tank tear through his soldiers with growing rage. The human's antique war machine was decimating his forces, turning his triumphant invasion into a rout. "All units concentrate fire on that tank," Belos roared into his comm. "Tear it apart." Xindi soldiers swarmed from every direction, plasma bolts splashing off the tank from all sides. Craig hunkered low, trying to present the smallest target. Even the tank's heavy armor couldn't withstand this onslaught for long. Belos jabbed a claw at his comm officer. "Summon the warships! Burn that tank to molten slag!" Scant seconds later, the scream of engines filled the air as a wing of Xindi fighters streaked overhead. Sizzling plasma bolts rained down, exploding all around the tank. Craig swore, fighting to keep the bucking vehicle under control. "We can't take much more of this," he shouted over the din of impacts. Mike racked his brain, desperate for a plan. His eyes fell on a crumpled tourist map of the city, fluttering on the floor. The museum. A wild idea formed. "Craig, the museum. They have that old fighter jet on display from the war, if it's still got fuel." "A 100-year-old fighter. You're crazier than me. Will it even still fly?" "Only one way to find out. Not like we have a lot of options here." Craig wrenched the tank into a hard turn, smashing through the wall of a building for cover. Xindi soldiers poured in behind them, plasma bolts sizzling past. The museum loomed ahead, its facade cratered and scorched. Craig plowed the tank straight through the museum's front doors, pulverizing priceless artifacts beneath its churning treads. The fighter jet sat on a plinth in the main atrium, an old F-86 Sabre in faded livery. Mike leapt from the tank and sprinted to the jet, vaulting into the cockpit. As he frantically flipped switches and pumped fuel primers, Craig swung the tank around to face the shattered entrance. Xindi soldiers boiled through the gap, plasma rifles blazing. Craig sent shell after shell into their midst, blasting them apart in sprays of gore and shrapnel. But more and more poured in, heedless of the losses, and above the din of battle, he heard the rising scream of Xindi fighters rushing in for another pass at the museum. "Mike!" he bellowed over the external speakers. "Now or never." With a cough and a sputter, the ancient jet engines caught, their whine building to a deafening roar. Mike let out a triumphant whoop as the fighter shook off 100 years of dust. Craig grinned fiercely, swiveling the tank to face the museum entrance, its gun barking as Xindi soldiers poured through the rubble. "Gus," Craig shouted into the radio, "I'll keep these bastards off your back." Mike slammed the throttle forward. The jet surged down the museum hall, blasting priceless artifacts into dust. With a screech of metal on stone, it clawed into the air, engines howling. Xindi fighters split the sky, plasma bolts stitching toward Mike's tail. The old jet groaned as he wrenched it into a climb, G-forces slamming him back in the seat. The Xindi fell in behind him, alien curses snarling over the radio. Mike jinked and juked, the jet responding like an extension of his will. Plasma sizzled past the canopy. He gritted his teeth, fingering the trigger. The Xindi filled his gun sight, ugly alien fighters spitting fire. Mike squeezed the trigger, the jet's cannons barking. Tracers reached out, stitching holes across alien hulls. One fighter exploded in a plume of flame, then another. On the ground, Craig bellowed in savage joy as Mike dueled the alien craft. The respite was short-lived. A plasma bolt slammed into the tank, rocking it on its treads. Belos stormed from the museum's depths, eyes blazing with hate, a squad of elite warriors at his back. Craig swung the gun to face the Xindi commander, but Belos was faster. A searing plasma bolt punched into the tank's flank, leaving it scorched and sparking. Belos raised his rifle for a killing shot at the treads. Gritting his teeth, Craig wrenched the controls. The tank lurched aside as Belos's shot sizzled past, blackening the street. Craig hammered the trigger, the gun roaring. The shells screamed toward Belos, but the Xindi was already moving. The round slammed into his flickering shield, dissipating in a flash of light. Belos snarled, bounding forward with feline grace. His rifle spat plasma, bolts pinging off the tank's hull. Craig frantically worked the controls, fighting to bring the lumbering vehicle's gun to bear. Too slow. Belos was inside the tank's turning circle, pummeling its flanks with shot after shot. Alarms blared in the cockpit, red lights flashing. The tank shuddered, treads grinding in protest. Craig swung the hull, desperately trying to crush Belos against a building, but the agile Xindi danced aside. Above, Mike saw Craig's plight. Alien fighters swarmed around him, cannons blazing. Mike gritted his teeth and shoved the stick forward, diving into the furball with guns blazing. Xindi ships scattered, several falling in flames. Mike leveled out, engines screaming, rocketing down to the street. Belos filled his gun sight, the alien's shield flickering as it strained to repel the tank's shells. Mike squeezed the trigger, cannons thundering. Belos's shield flared and died as Mike's shots pounded into it. The Xindi commander roared in pain and rage as rounds tore into his armor, stumbling back. Mike pulled up, G-forces slamming him into the seat, alien shots sizzling past. Craig seized the opening, the tank surging forward. Belos leapt aside, breathing heavily, murder in his eyes. With a snarl of alien invective, he signaled a retreat, bounding into the shadows of a ruined building. Craig sagged back in his seat, sweat stinging his eyes. He keyed the radio with a shaking hand. "Mike, you beautiful bastard. Thought I was done for." "Can't let you have all the fun," Mike quipped, his voice tight with strain as he jinked and juked through a swarm of Xindi fighters. Craig's eyes fell on the pulsing lights of the alien warship above, raining destruction on the city. His jaw clenched. "Form up on me. We're taking that warship out, or we're all dead anyway. Humanity won't survive another day of this." The acrid stench of smoke and ozone filled the cramped tank interior as Craig keyed the radio. "Colonel Briggs, this is Young. We read you. What's your status? Over?" Briggs's voice crackled through the static. "Craig, thank God. We've got EMP grenades that can take out that Xindi warship, but we're pinned down on the east side. Need you to punch a hole through their lines so we can get to the city center." Craig exchanged a look with Mike. The odds were grim, but what choice did they have? He keyed the mic. "Roger that, Colonel. We'll give 'em a hell of a distraction. Young out." Mike grinned fiercely as he primed the jet's cannons. "Just like old times, huh? Let's give these alien bastards a taste of human spirit." Craig gunned the engine, the tank roaring as it surged forward. "Hoo-ah! Draw their fire and keep 'em off balance. Briggs and his team need to get through." The tank smashed through the rubble-choked streets, Craig angling for the fiercest pockets of Xindi resistance. Plasma bolts splashed off the hull as alien soldiers swarmed from the ruins. Craig returned fire with the main gun, blasting them to bloody mist. Above, Mike danced through the sky, cannons thundering as he strafed Xindi positions. Alien bodies and wrecked vehicles littered the streets in his wake. Xindi curses snarled across the radio bands. Belos watched the human assault with narrowed eyes, seething as the primitives ravaged his troops. How could they be so formidable with such antiquated weapons? No matter. He would crush their pathetic resistance soon enough. A flashing light on the command console drew his attention, an intercepted human signal. Belos stabbed a claw at the display, an ugly grin spreading across his face as he listened to Briggs' transmission. "All forces converge on the human's position," Belos snarled. "Do not let them reach the city center." As Craig and Mike wreaked havoc across the city, drawing the Xindi like moths to a flame, Briggs and his ragtag band slipped through the carnage. They ducked through shattered buildings and sprinted across cratered streets, closing in on the warship's looming bulk. But the Xindi were waiting for them. Warriors boiled from every crevice and ruin, plasma rifles spitting death. Briggs men fought for each inch of ground, EMP grenades clutched tight. Belos strode to the front lines, his scaled face a mask of hate. He would take great pleasure in killing these humans personally and mounting their leader's head on his command chair. A tremendous explosion rocked the street as a plasma mortar struck home. Humans screamed as the blast tore through their ranks. Belos laughed, leveling his rifle at Briggs's distant form. Suddenly, an armor-piercing shell slammed into the Xindi lines, vaporizing a knot of warriors. The tank burst from the settling dust, its hull pockmarked and scorched, Craig roaring a battle cry over the speakers. The sky above shattered with a sonic boom as Mike plummeted from the clouds, cannons blazing. Belos swore in his native tongue, signaling a fighting retreat. His forces fell back to the warship's perimeter as Craig and Mike surged to Briggs's side, their weapons hammering the aliens. Briggs scrambled aboard the tank, eyes wild. The EMP grenades are primed. We have to get them inside the warship's shields. Craig gritted his teeth, glancing at the pulsing warship above and the armies of Xindi warriors swarming beneath it. The fight of their lives lay ahead, with the fate of Earth hanging in the balance. He met Mike's gaze, seeing the same grim determination there. No words were needed. They knew what had to be done. Sucking in a breath, Craig jammed the throttle to full, the tank lurching toward the looming alien ship, and the armies massing to stop them. The acrid stench of smoke and ozone filled the cramped tank interior as Craig keyed the radio. "Mike, we gotta split up. Draw those fighters off Colonel Briggs." Mike's voice crackled back, tight with strain, as he jinked the jet through a storm of plasma. "Roger that. I'll keep these bastards busy. Get to Briggs." Craig wrenched the tank into a hard turn, its treads churning rubble. Mike stood the jet on its tail, afterburners howling as he clawed for altitude. Xindi fighters swarmed after him, their cannons stitching the sky. On the ground, Craig pushed the battered tank to its limits. The huge machine crashed through walls and barricades, alien alloys crumpling like foil. Xindi warriors screamed as 65 tons of human defiance crushed them into paste. Plasma bolts sizzled against the hull as Craig bulled towards Briggs's position. The impacts rocked him in his seat, alarms shrieking. He gritted his teeth and pushed on. There, Briggs's team crouched in a shell crater, pouring fire at the advancing Xindi. Belos loomed behind his warriors, roaring commands, his combat vehicle's cannons flashing. Craig didn't hesitate. He rammed the throttle to full and smashed into Belos's attack craft broadside. The impact slammed Craig forward in his harness. Belos's vehicle flipped like a kicked toy, alien bodies flung in all directions. Briggs leapt from cover, rallying his battered troops. EMP grenades, fry these alien bastards! Arcs of blue-white energy crackled from the grenades, the pulse washing over the Xindi. Warriors twitched and collapsed as their weapons and armor went dark, easy prey for the vengeful humans. Mike stood the jet on its wing, cannon hammering, engines screaming. Xindi ships fell from the sky, trailing smoke. He skidded to a landing by the crater, leaping down to join the fray, rifle in hand. Humans and Xindi clashed in brutal close quarters, Craig's tank shuddering as it crushed aliens beneath its bulk. Briggs fought to the looming warship, his men hurling EMP grenades to clear the way. Craig swung the turret, raking the warship's flank with shells. Xindi poured from the ship in a green tide, heedless of losses. Mike and Briggs pushed forward, rifles cracking, grenades sparking. The humans were only meters from the ship when a plasma bolt punched through Craig's frontal armor. He swore as the tank lurched, systems failing. More warriors rushed him, swarming the crippled vehicle. He thumbed his radio. "Briggs, blow that ship, we'll hold them here." Xindi clambered atop the tank, Craig's machine gun chattering until it ran dry. Mike shoved a grenade into a hull breach and sprinted clear. The explosion scattered the aliens like rag dolls. Briggs and his few remaining men vanished into the ship, the sounds of combat echoing from within. Craig and Mike fought on against the Xindi onslaught, hoping against hope. The warship shuddered, internal explosions belching gouts of fire and debris. The EMP grenades. Systems flickered and died as the pulse fried critical systems. A grating crash of metal on metal sounded as a blast tore a hole in the ship's flank. Belos burst from the gap, Briggs's throat in his fist, the human's face purple. Craig roared and surged from the tank, fighting to reach them. Belos raised his rifle to execute Briggs, just as a shell from Craig's battered tank struck home. The round punched through the weakened hull and detonated deep within the alien craft. The warship bucked like a living thing, flames gouting from rents in its armor. They surged into the ship's depths, trading shots with the desperate Xindi crew. EMP grenades arced down the corridors, the pulse sending aliens spasming to the deck, their weapons dead in their hands. It devolved into a brutal melee, humans and Xindi grappling in close quarters. Briggs smashed a warrior's face with his rifle butt, then drove a combat knife into another's throat. His men fought like demons, fury and desperation lending them strength. Suddenly a plasma bolt sizzled past Briggs's face. He spun to see Belos emerging from the smoke, the warlord's armor scorched and dented, his eyes blazing with hate. Briggs charged to meet him, a roar on his lips. They clashed in a whirlwind of blows, Briggs' rifle clanging off Belos's armored hide. The alien was a juggernaut, shrugging off hits that would fell a human. Belos caught Briggs' gun and wrenched it away, hurling the man back. Briggs rolled to his feet as Belos lunged, plasma blade hissing to life. He sidestepped a slash and countered with a kick that folded the alien over. Belos snarled and bulled into Briggs, slamming him against a bulkhead. Briggs grunted in pain as Belos's hands closed on his throat, the alien's hideous visage inches from his own. "Your world will burn, human," Belos hissed, "and you with it." With a burst of desperate strength, Briggs drove his thumb into Belos's eye. The warlord howled and recoiled. Briggs pressed the attack, pummeling Belos with blows that would shatter concrete. Beyond their duel, Briggs' men fought like lions, driving the Xindi back from the reactor 1 meter at a time. Grenades flew, and rifle fire stitched the air as the fate of Earth was decided in the warship's heart. Outside, Craig white-knuckled the tank controls, jaw clenched as he rammed the lumbering vehicle at the warship's landing strut. Metal screamed, and sparks fountained as 65 tons of human defiance met alien alloy. The tank ground forward, its treads churning, its hull pocked with plasma scars. Mike hosed the Xindi troops with the jet's cannons, alien bodies erupting into sprays of gore. A bolt hammered the jet and it lurched, smoke pouring from the engine. Craig urged the crippled tank on, the strut groaning as it started to buckle. Just a little more. A blinding flash erupted from the warship's belly, a roiling wave of blue-white energy washing out to envelop the battle. The pulse slammed into the Xindi like a hammer blow, warriors convulsing as their weapons and armor went dark. In the ship's heart, Belos had Briggs pinned, the human's face purple as the warlord crushed his throat. Briggs scrabbled weakly at Belos's grip, the edges of his vision darkening. Belos stumbled as the ship pitched beneath them, systems failing. Briggs didn't hesitate. He leveled the rifle and unloaded into the warlord's chest until the gun ran dry. The warship shuddered like a wounded beast, reeling as the EMP burned through its circuits. Explosions flowered in its depths, fire belching from rents in its hull. It lurched in the air, then nosed over, plummeting towards the ground far below. The warship shuddered and broke apart as it plummeted, wreathed in smoke and flame. Massive chunks of hull plating and debris hurtled toward the city below. Craig wrenched the tank's controls, engine roaring as he charged toward the largest piece. The impact would level buildings for blocks. He had to break it up. Roger! The jet thundered by overhead, missiles sparking from its wings. Explosions blossomed along the plummeting hulk, the blasts tearing it into more manageable pieces. Craig weaved the tank through the deadly rain of shrapnel. His world narrowed to falling metal, and the desperate dance to avoid it. A jagged spar speared the street ahead, Craig barely swerving clear. The near miss rattled his teeth. Above, Mike rolled and jinked, the jet groaning as he hurled it between tumbling blocks of hull plating. His missiles streaked out again and again, pulverizing the lethal debris into less catastrophic bits. Sweat ran into his eyes, heart pounding, hands white-knuckled on the stick. Suddenly plasma bolts sizzled past his canopy. Mike swore, wrenching the jet into a gut-churning climb. Belos. The Xindi commander had escaped the dying ship in a small shuttle and now bore down on Mike with murder in his eyes. "Craig, Belos is on my tail," Mike shouted, juking desperately as the Xindi's shot scorched his hull. "I can't shake him." On the ground, Craig gritted his teeth, mind racing. He couldn't abandon the task of breaking up the debris, but he couldn't leave Mike to Belos's mercies either. The tank's gun roared, shells screaming towards Belos's craft. The Xindi rolled and wove, plasma cannons hammering back. The duel was on. Elsewhere, Colonel Briggs stumbled from the wreckage of the warship, ears ringing, uniform scorched. His surviving men staggered out behind him, battered but determined. He rallied them with a bark. "On your feet, the fight's not over. Get the civilians to safety and form a perimeter. Move." As his soldiers scrambled to obey, Briggs raised his eyes to the aerial battle unfolding above. Craig's tank and Mike's jet danced a deadly waltz with Belos's shuttle, the Xindi commander displaying a chilling level of skill. Briggs knew his men could handle the ground, but Craig and Mike needed help in the skies. "Tally bricks!" he snapped to his two best marksmen. "Find a high vantage point and see if you can put some holes in that shuttle." As the soldiers hustled to comply, Briggs turned his gaze to the ongoing evacuation, a grim set to his jaw. The battle still raged, and the fate of the city, perhaps the world, hung in the balance. High above, Craig and Mike fought like men possessed, the tank and jet moving in perfect sync despite the chaos. Mike lined up his remaining missiles on Belos's craft, fingers flying over the targeting computer. "Missiles locked," he crowed. "Eat this, you alien son of a bitch." He squeezed the trigger, and nothing happened. Mike's stomach dropped into his boots. The missile ports were jammed, the mechanisms fused from one too many close calls. He was out of ordnance. "Craig, I'm Winchester," he called, fighting to keep the despair from his voice. "We gotta take this fight to the ground." "Roger that," Craig replied grimly. "I've got an idea. Head for the old industrial sector, Sector 12. We'll use the terrain, limit his mobility, make the bastard come to us." "On it. I'll keep him focused on me." Mike hurled the jet into a screaming dive, engines howling. Belos predictably followed, plasma cannons blazing. The chase was on. Craig floored the accelerator, the tank surging down ruined streets as he made for the looming industrial ruins. It would be close quarters, brutal and unforgiving, just the way he liked it. Belos was in for the fight of his life. The Xindi had the tech, but the humans had heart, grit, and a bone-deep refusal to die. The alien was about to learn that the hard way. As the tank crashed through the ruined gates of the abandoned complex, Craig allowed himself a predatory smile. The real battle was about to begin. Belos snarled as he landed his crippled shuttle atop the dam, sparks spitting from ruptured conduits. He could already hear the roar of the human's jet approaching, the bark of its cannons stitching the air. No matter. They were too late. The Xindi commander slammed his fist on the shuttle's hatch release, the door grinding open on protesting servos. He grabbed the explosive charge and leapt out onto the dam's narrow walkway, a cold wind whipping at his scales. Far below, the reservoir's dark waters churned. A missile streaked from Mike's jet, slamming into the shuttle's flank in a gout of flame. The craft lurched over the dam's edge, trailing smoke and debris as it plummeted into the gorge. Belos barely spared it a glance, already running for the dam's control room, the explosive clutched tight. The jet thundered past overhead, engines screaming, Mike fighting to bring the damaged craft around for another pass. On the valley floor below, Craig urged the battered tank up the narrow access road, its treads chewing the asphalt, engine roaring. He had to reach the top before Belos could prime the charge. Mike slewed the jet into a banking turn, the airframe groaning, warning lights flickering across the console. Through the spider-webbed canopy, he saw Belos reach the control room, the Xindi's movements urgent. Mike gritted his teeth and pushed the throttle to the firewall. The jet hurtled toward the dam, cannons blazing. Rounds punched into the concrete around Belos, the Xindi diving for cover. Mike held down the trigger until the guns ran dry, spent shells clattering across the cockpit floor. Belos rose from behind a shattered console, murder in his eyes, the explosive still clutched in his fist. Mike knew he had only one chance. He yanked the ejection handle. The canopy blew clear with a crack of explosive bolts, the command seat rocketing Mike into the howling wind. He fought to control his trajectory, aiming for the walkway where Belos stood. At the last second, he kicked free of the chair, hurtling through the air. Mike slammed into Belos in a tangle of limbs, the impact sending them skidding across the walkway. The explosive clattered from Belos's grip, sliding toward the edge. Both man and Xindi lunged for it, grappling furiously. Below, Craig pushed the tank to its limits up the winding road, the temperature gauges deep in the red. The treads skidded on the crumbling asphalt, the heavy vehicle fighting for traction. Craig coaxed it on, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the battling figures above. Mike drove a knee into Belos's ribs, fighting to pin the Xindi commander. Belos snarled and twisted, his superior strength coming to bear. He forced Mike back, clawed hands scrabbling for the human's throat. They rolled across the walkway, exchanging brutal blows, the explosive forgotten in their primal struggle. Mike headbutted Belos, feeling the alien's scales split. Belos roared and lashed out, talons raking Mike's face. Suddenly the dam shook beneath them, a sound like thunder rolling across the valley. Craig. The tank crested the ridge, its main cannon swiveling to target Belos. Mike went limp, letting Belos shove him away. Craig pulled the trigger. The tank bucked as the shell hurtled toward Belos. The Xindi had a split second to register the danger before the round struck the walkway beneath his feet, pulverizing concrete and metal. Belos vanished in a maelstrom of debris and smoke. Mike crawled to the edge, peering down into the churning water far below. There was no sign of Belos. He looked up as Craig clambered from the tank's hatch, running to join him. "The explosive," Mike croaked, struggling to his feet. They scanned the walkway frantically. There, the device lay perilously close to the shattered edge, a small light on its casing blinking rapidly. The timer. Craig sprinted for the bomb, Mike close on his heels. Craig skidded to his knees beside it, hands shaking as he examined the detonator. Mike stood guard, eyes raking their surroundings for any sign of Belos. The seconds ticked down, each one an eternity. Craig's fingers flew over the wiring, sweat beading his brow despite the cold wind. He had to pick just the right circuit to interrupt, or the fail-safes would trigger the detonation. The light blinked faster, the bomb emitting a rising whine. Mike tensed, fists clenched, powerless to help. It all came down to Craig's skill and luck. Craig made his choice, hand hovering over a tangle of wires. He glanced up at Mike, the ghost of a smile on his lips, despite the dire situation. "No boom today," he said, and yanked a wire free. The light winked out, the whine fading to silence. The bomb lay dead and inert. Craig and Mike traded a look of relief, adrenaline still surging through their veins. A sudden roar split the air, a sound of pure primal rage. Belos! The Xindi commander hauled himself over the parapet, armor shredded, ichor leaking from a dozen wounds. His eyes blazed with a ferocity that was barely sane. Mike stepped forward, placing himself between Belos and Craig. He raised his fists, a tight grin on his bloody face. "Round two, you alien bastard." Belos charged, a wordless snarl on his lips, claws extended. Mike met him head-on, the battle joined once more atop the shattered dam, the fate of Earth hanging in the balance. Craig braced himself against the dam's concrete lip and hauled on the cable, muscles straining. Mike's sweat-slick hands burned as he was dragged up the face of the dam, legs kicking at the sheer wall. With a final heave, Craig pulled Mike over the edge. They collapsed together on the narrow walkway, chests heaving, adrenaline still surging. Mike clapped a hand on Craig's shoulder. Cutting it a bit close there, buddy, he panted. Craig let out a breathless laugh. You're welcome. A triumphant grin split Mike's face as he pulled himself to his feet. He leaned over the dam's edge, scanning the churning water far below. No sign of Belos. He's fish food now, Mike spat. Good riddance to that scaly bastard. Craig joined him at the railing, tension still tight in his shoulders. It seemed too easy after all the death and destruction Belos had caused, but the Xindi commander was gone, swept away by the raging current. Their radios crackled to life, Colonel Briggs' voice cutting through the static. Craig, Mike, come in. The Xindi are falling back all over the city. We've got them on the run. Relief crashed over Craig like a wave. He keyed his mic. That's the best news I've heard all day, Colonel. We'll regroup at your position. The line went dead. Craig and Mike traded a look, too exhausted to celebrate just yet. They still had work to do. The trek back through the battered city was a grim one. Smoke hung thick in the air, obscuring the sun. Buildings lay in ruin, some still belching flame. Plasma-scorched vehicles and twisted alien metal littered the cratered streets. And the bodies. Dear God, the bodies. Everywhere they looked, human and Xindi alike sprawled in the rubble. Some clutched weapons, faces frozen in snarls of rage. Others still bore expressions of terror, cut down as they fled. Men, women, the old, and the heartbreakingly young. Craig and Mike picked their way through the devastation in silence, the weight of it all pressing down on their shoulders. This was their city, their home. And now it was a tomb. They found Briggs and the remnants of the human resistance holed up in the shell of a collapsed parking garage. Wounded filled the structure, laid out on scorched concrete, medics scrambling between them. Shell-shocked survivors huddled in small clusters, faces blank. Briggs looked up as Craig and Mike approached, his face haggard beneath a layer of grime. He clasped their hands firmly. "Knew I could count on you two," he said. "We gave 'em hell today." "But at what cost?" Craig asked quietly, gaze sweeping over the rows of wounded. It was cold comfort, but it was something. Mike nodded towards the ruins of downtown. "What's our next move? The Xindi won't stay gone for long." "We fortify," Briggs said grimly. "Dig in, rebuild our defenses, and we pray they don't come back before we can—" A shout from the perimeter cut him off. "Contact, single target, closing fast." Weapons snapped up, safeties clicking off. Craig and Mike joined the line of defenders, nerves still raw. A lone figure stumbled from the rubble, its gait uneven. Curses and threats rippled through the human ranks. Fingers tightened on triggers, but Briggs held up a hand. "Hold your fire!" The Xindi was badly wounded, its scaled hide scorched and torn, ichor oozing from a dozen rents in its armor. It lurched drunkenly from side to side, weapon nowhere in sight. It made it a dozen more steps before its legs gave out, and it collapsed to its knees. It looked up at the ring of guns surrounding it, its slitted eyes glazed with pain. "I am Jeren," it wheezed, its voice grating and thin. "Soldier of the Xindi Empire, I come with a message." Briggs stepped forward warily, rifle still trained on the alien's chest. "Speak." Jeren coughed, the sound wet and thick. A dribble of dark blood leaked from the corner of his mouth. This attack, it was a mistake, the actions of a rogue faction seeking glory and conquest. The words were labored, forced out between panting breaths. The Xindi Empire does not condone this. There will be consequences. Briggs' eyes narrowed. Consequences? You slaughter our people, raze our city, and you speak of consequences. Jeren shook his head weakly. You must understand. Not all Xindi wanted this, the war, the bloodshed. A spasm racked his body, and he curled in on himself, keening. I'm sorry for what was done to you, to your world. His voice was fading, his eyes going distant. There is so much you don't know, so much we never... The light went out of Jeren's eyes, and he slumped sideways, his final breath rattling from his chest. Silence descended, broken only by the low moans of the wounded. Craig stepped forward and knelt by the dead Xindi, reaching out to close its eyes. He looked up at Briggs, at Mike, at the battered remnants of the human resistance. What did he mean? What don't we know? Briggs could only shake his head. Exhaustion and grief etched into every line of his face. I don't know, but I aim to find out. He turned to face his troops, his expression hardening into something like resolve. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The Xindi think they can just apologize and walk away after all they've done? No, there will be a reckoning. A ragged cheer went up from the assembled humans. They had lost much, but they still had their pride, their anger, their thirst for vengeance. Mike helped Craig to his feet, the two friends leaning on each other for support. They looked out over the ruins of their city, at the smoke still rising from the rubble. Craig's fist clenched at his side. Now we rebuild, we rearm, and we get ready. His gaze turned to the sky, to the stars just beginning to peek through the haze. Out there somewhere the Xindi lurked, waiting, watching. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the world in shades of blood and fire. Craig and Mike turned to join the other survivors, to begin the long, painful process of picking up the pieces. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.